everybody, and welcome to an episode of Echo Live. My name is Anna, and I'm coming to you from the Michigan Science Center's Echo Distance Learning Program. Happy Monday, everybody. I've got a very special program planned for us. Today, we are going to be doing another dissection of something kind of unique. This is another very simple dissection that is easy for students to recreate, not necessarily at home using these types of materials, but hopefully this is a dissection that you'll get to do in school one day if you haven't done so already. Today we'll be dissecting owl pellets, which are going to give us an up-close look at the diet of owls and other large predatory birds. Now, if we're looking at the diet of these different kinds of birds, maybe you know this because you've done this dissection either at school or in an after-school program, or maybe you've heard of this before, but can anyone tell me what exactly is an owl pellet? Have you heard of that before? Do you know what an owl pellet is? Have you ever seen one? This is a great opportunity for you to use the chat feature if you haven't done so already. If you have a guess or you know what an owl pellet is, tell me in the chat. If you don't have a guess quite yet, that's okay. But remember that the chat feature is your way of interacting with me throughout the entire program. You can use the chat to ask me questions, to answer some of the questions that I have, and I'll keep an eye on the chat and try to answer as many of those questions as I can. Lots of people are familiar with owl pellets. A couple friends are telling us that they've done this dissection before, getting some interesting answers. So we are looking at the diet of these birds, right? And so we're not dissecting an owl itself. And so if we were to dissect or take a look at the diet, right, we need to be looking at something that the bird has already eaten. Lots of guesses coming in telling me that maybe this is owl poop, but that's actually not the case. Owl pellets are not owl poop. They're actually regurgitated remains of the animals that they have eaten or digested. So this is actually more, it's very interesting. We'll take a very up close look at one of these owl pellets, but it's not poop. It's actually throw up, but it's very, very different than what we might think it might look like. They're real interesting, and this is a great dissection if you're interested in things like paleontology or life science, because we're going to cover a few different themes today using these different programs. So today we're dissecting an owl pellet, which again is the regurgitated remains of different things that owls have eaten. So before we get to the dissection itself, let's first talk a little bit about food webs. Now, we love to talk about food webs at the Michigan Science Center, and a food web is a bit different than a food chain. And we actually prefer to use the term food web when we're talking about animals and their environments and the different organisms that are involved in these transfers of energy. We call it a web because as we start adding organisms to this diagram here on our slides, you'll notice that it looks a lot more like a web than a chain. It's really not just one straight line. There are lots of interconnecting parts, right? Because it's very, very rare in nature that an animal only eats one thing. Think about what you eat every day or maybe even every week. Do we eat just one kind of food or one type of organism? Not normally, right? I can think of at least 4 different things that I've eaten today. And so just like our diets are diverse, most animals have a pretty diverse diet as well. That's not to say that certain organisms can't eat just one specific kind of thing, but that is pretty rare in nature. So we're going to start down here at the bottom of our food web. So we have some grass down here, and we've noted that grass is what we call a producer, because there's actually one thing that's going to be missing from this food web. So if grass is a producer, meaning that it feeds the organisms above it on the food chain, where does grass get its energy from? Can anyone tell me, where does grass get its energy? How does it produce food or energy in order to continue living? Because grass is alive, just like an animal, because it is a living thing, even though it's not an animal. It is a plant, so it is alive. Where does grass get its energy? Tell me in the chat once you have a guess or an answer to that question. Great answers, everybody. Some people are telling me from the sun. That is absolutely correct, and from the soil as well. So we know that plants get their energy from the sun. They're actually able to take sunlight and turn it into sugars and into energy for them to use for their life processes. Jason in Zoom has a great phrase for this: from abiotic factors of the environment. So grass gets its energy from abiotic or non-living factors. The sun is not alive, but it's very, very important because that's the source of energy for all of our producers, like grass. Now, what do we call organisms that eat grass or that eat plant life? Does anyone know what the term for those types of organisms are? What do we call organisms that eat plants? Only plants, if that helps at all. Good answers, everybody. We'll wait for a couple more answers to come in. You guys really know your life science stuff. Producers give energy to the organisms above them in the food web. We call those organisms that get all their energy from only plants, no other kinds of organisms, we call them, oh, there we go, I want to go this way, herbivores. Great answers, everybody. We call them herbivores. Herbivores meaning that they only eat plants, not other animals. So this is where it starts to look like a web, right? So we call it a web because there are more than one type of organism that eats grass, right? We've got examples like insects, like crickets. We've got mice. We've got rabbits. All of these are herbivores, which get all of their energy from plant matter. Now, if we go one more level up from these herbivores, where these arrows would point next, so we've got arrows pointing from the grass to our herbivores, where would our energy go next? What kind of organisms get their energy from other animals? What would we call those types of organisms? That would be right up next on the next part of our food web. What would we call those? So, organisms that eat other animals. So organisms that eat animals. What would we call those? Good answers starting to come in. If you don't know what we might call them, maybe you can think of an example of some sort of organism that might eat one of these three organisms are herbivores. So can you think of an organism that eats insects? Can you think of an organism that might eat mice or rabbits out in nature, out in our kind of forest ecosystem? Jason tells me that we would call those next level of organisms, we would call them omnivores and carnivores. Now, in this diagram, we only have arrows coming from animals. We don't have any arrows coming from the grass and from the animals. And so we are going to call the next set of organisms primary carnivores. So animals that eat other animals is what we would call this level of our food web. And you can see that, again, it really looks like a web because the field mice might feed both the snakes and the rats. So rats will eat smaller mice, but we also have the cricket feeding up here to a kind of mystery organism that we haven't revealed yet. The crickets feed the rat, and you can see that these arrows are now getting really, really interconnected because all these animals live in the same ecosystem. They can often compete or share food sources, and they can also eat different types of organisms so that they're not just limited to one thing, because that could be bad, right? If we think about, if say all that there was for these primary carnivores to eat, if there was only one thing, if there was only these field mice, right? That would increase competition and we might run out of field mice, right? So if we have organisms competing for a limited resource, we would eventually eliminate our population of field mice altogether. And unless one of these predators was able to travel to another ecosystem to find more food, right, that would affect our food web going up because they would no longer have their only type of food source. So it's important that these arrows interconnect as much as possible. That way, our ecosystem is very, very diverse. Now, some people are recognizing that these are all organisms that maybe they've seen before. So these organisms are pretty common to places like Michigan. If you live in a wooded area or areas with lots of trees and vegetation, you might have seen even some of these animals in your backyard or in your neighborhood or maybe behind your school or where your parents work. So these are common animals. Now, we're missing one last piece of our food web here, and it's on the very, very top. Does anyone know what we might call that next step or that very last piece of this food web? What might we call that very last piece? Good answers. Lots of people guessing what organism specifically it might be. So if we have primary carnivores here, if we have another animal that eats these animals, we would call those secondary carnivores. Good job, everybody. You really do know your life science, and that is so exciting to me as someone who loves biology and loves life science. So we've got our secondary carnivores here, and in this food web, we might call this owl the apex predator. So we might call this owl the apex predator because you'll notice as far as this food web goes, there is nothing above the owl. There is no organism that eats this owl. The owl is at the top of the food web. So it has a few different sources of energy. It could eat the field mice, it could eat the rabbits, it could even eat the crickets if it were looking for a very protein-filled snack. It will eat almost any of these organisms except our producer, the grass. So owls are not omnivores. Owls are carnivores. They only eat other animals, and they'll eat almost any smaller animal that they can get their claws on or their talons on, which is interesting when it comes to our dissection that we're about to do. The only other important part of this diagram that there is to note is that the arrows, I've written that those represent energy flow. So it can often be confusing when you're looking at a web like this one and think that the arrow points from one thing to the thing that it eats, but we've already kind of figured out that it's the exact opposite. So the grass doesn't eat the mice and the mice doesn't eat the owl, but it's the opposite. So the arrows in a food web represent the flow of energy, which starts from the sun and starts from the grass and moves its way up the food web to the top of the food web or the food chain, which we would call the apex predator or the tertiary consumers. So you guys have really impressed me with your food web knowledge and your knowledge of life science. And so let's get into the dissection today. We said that we are dissecting owl pellets. And what's super fun about these dissections is that we'll get to do some bone identification, which I said can be pretty similar to the study of paleontology or the study of fossils. So when these owl pellets come out, they're big, gray, fluffy balls, almost the size of a ping pong ball. And it's all of the organic matter that the owl is not able to digest. So like all birds cannot chew. They don't have molars like humans do, so they can't chew their food and grind it up. What they do is they actually swallow the organism whole, and they can do other things to aid their digestive process, like swallowing stones or dirt, which will help to grind up the food that they swallow. They swallow their food, it goes right to their crop, where it then absorbs all of the nutrients from these organisms. So we said it doesn't eat plants. Owls only eat other animals like rodents or shrews, moles, or smaller birds. And then when it's done digesting the parts that are nutritious, when it's done digesting everything that gives the owl energy, all that's left over is really those indigestible pieces, things like bones and fur and skin and cartilage, all that kind of stuff that doesn't necessarily have nutritional value, which is what we are going to be dissecting from the owl pellet today. So it's important to have one of these bone identification sheets. That way, when we are acting as paleontologists might, and we are very carefully extracting some of these bones and other pieces of our organisms, that we can identify exactly what we're looking at and try to figure out the diet of these organisms. Now, these owl pellets are pretty small, right? You have to imagine that it has to be small enough that the owl could have actually regurgitated it. So they actually come to us wrapped up in tinfoil just like this. Like I said, it's about the size of a ping pong ball, so very, very small. But you'll notice as we start to dissect it that there's quite a bit packed into just one of these owl pellets, because birds, like owls, can often eat lots and lots of smaller organisms before they actually produce an owl pellet. So there might even be more than one type of food inside our pellets here. Elena in Facebook actually asked a great question, and she asked, are humans apex predators? So before we start the dissection, yes, that is absolutely correct. Humans are apex predators. And we think of it like that, right? Because there's nothing above us in our food web. There is nothing that uses humans as a regular source of food. That's not to say that there aren't animals out there that could eat humans if that was their only choice, but there is no ecosystem on Earth where humans are not the apex predator, where we are not at the top of our food chain. Humans are pretty well adapted, right? We're able to use tools in order to hunt our food. We're able to protect ourselves. So humans are always apex predators, but that's not to say, right, that something couldn't happen. And there are animals that have killed humans, but it's just not very common that they're using humans as their regular source of food, because that would be very, very odd. Maybe except zombies. You never know. All right, so let's switch our camera over here to our document camera so that we can take an up-close look at this dissection. And just like with our flower dissection, we really don't need very many tools for this type of dissection. It would help, obviously, if I turn off my virtual background as normal. But you can see that I've got my little tinfoil wrapped owl pellet right here on the tray. And we're going to be dissecting it using just two things. So I've got some tweezers here, which is going to help me to extract some of those furry pieces of our owl pellet, leaving the bones behind. And then I also have an unwound paper clip, and you'll see why this is really important. But think about the tools that scientists would use if you've ever seen someone who is digging for a dinosaur fossil, right? This dissection is extremely delicate. We need to be very, very careful with our owl pellet because the bones inside are very small and very, very breakable. So we'll just set our tinfoil off to the side. And this is what an owl pellet looks like before we break into it. So remember that this is not poop. This owl pellet is a regurgitated piece of remains of the organisms that the owl ate. And you might think it's kind of gross that I'm touching it with my hands. It really is easier just to use your hands during this dissection. And these owl pellets come to us autoclaved, which means that they've been baked or exposed to really, really high temperatures for a very long period of time, which is long enough that no living bacteria or organisms or larvae or anything like that could survive inside this owl pellet. So this owl pellet is completely sterile, it is sanitized, and there is nothing to worry about. If you ever get to do this at school, you can certainly do this with your own two hands, which is what I'm going to do here today. If you think that's gross, that's okay. You could certainly wear some disposable gloves if you wanted to, if you ever had the opportunity to do this dissection. But again, it is not necessary because when we purchase them from a scientific supply company, they come to us completely sterilized. So no reason to worry. So you can see that the first thing I've done is I'm just starting to break the owl pellet up into some pieces. Now, I'm not forcing it open. I'm not trying to break anything that might be inside, because you can see that just by kind of peeling some of those furry pieces back, that we're already starting to expose some very interesting things from inside our owl pellet. We'll be referring to this dissection guide, which is very, very useful because it's sorted all of our different bones and pieces of these organisms by type. So we might find things like vertebrae, which are pieces of the spine of these animals. We're going to find lots of ribs. We'll find things like front legs, which you can see, depending on the organism, look very, very different from each other. We also have scapula, which are the shoulder bones. So if you kind of reach back and you were to give yourself a pat on the back, pat, what you're tapping is your scapula in a human. And so we might find some of those. The easiest way to identify the type of food that these owls ate is by the skull. And so you can see most of these skulls consist of two main pieces, kind of the cranial side of the skull and then a jawbone as well. So they're all broken down by different types. There are going to be tons and tons of tiny little feet bones, most of them honestly too small that we might not even be able to distinguish them or find them. They might get lost in the fluff. But then there's also hind leg and pelvis, of course. All right, so let's get into these owl pellets here. And we said that we can already start to see something very, very large and very noticeable in some of these pellets. So the first one I'd like to look at is this one right here, because we said the easiest way to identify the food or the organism is by pieces of their skull. And we have a very, very obvious piece of a jawbone here. It's really easy to tell it's a jawbone because it's got a big tooth on it. So let me try to focus my camera here on this piece of the jaw. One more time. Might not want to. Let's see. Maybe if I put it on the tinfoil. But you can see that that is a piece of a jaw of one of our organisms here. There's a tooth. This is where your jaw would connect. And so that's the joint where it would connect so that these animals are able to chew their food. And let's take a look at our diagram of skulls and see if we can match this one up. Let's take a look. It's got a very, very large, very pointy piece there. So tell me, based on these skulls, does anyone have a guess as to which type of jawbone is this right here? Put it just somewhere right in the center, since we're not quite sure yet. But take a look and tell me in the chat, what type of animal do you think this jawbone belongs to? Is it a bird, a mole, a rodent, or a shrew? Take a moment. I'll try to keep my hands as still as possible there. I can always set this down and zoom back in on it. See a couple of people starting to guess, right? And so this is the most important part of this dissection, right? Because we can learn a lot from these dissections. We can learn all about the ecosystems of this animal without actually being very intrusive of their life. So just by taking a look at these animal remains, right, we can tell the population of certain animals in an environment, right? So depending on how many of these different types of animals we find might tell us something about the populations out in that environment. And it might tell us about the health of these owls, if they're getting a good enough diversity of their diet. Good job, everybody. I will agree. It seems like most of us are identifying this as a rodent skull. So I would agree. I think based on the shape of the tooth and the orientation of the teeth, this is certainly a rodent jaw. And you can see it even better if I turn it to this side. You can even see those smaller little teeth, even besides the big pointy incisor. So good job, everybody. That's the first step. And honestly, the most important is being able to compare it to our dissection guide in order to identify what we're looking at. Now, we said we're going to find all sorts of bones in here, and I can tell that there's something pretty large over on this side of the owl pellet. This is one of those dissections that takes a good amount of patience because there are just a ton of stuff packed inside these owl pellets. Priya in Facebook asked, can these owl pellets contain more than one animal? And the answer is absolutely. They can absolutely contain more than one animal because you and I need to eat more than one meal per day, and so do birds. Birds can eat quite a bit. So they will eat up to 2, maybe 3 or 4 small animals, and those can all come out in one pellet depending on the time that they eat these animals. Now you can see that even when I just broke apart, you can see that I'm starting to pull out some smaller pieces. And before we get into identifying those, what I'm doing is just sorting them by what they look like. So these two look very similar to each other. These two look like they're the same type of bone from the same type of animal. I've got our jaw piece set over to the side, and I'm just going to continue doing that as we pick through our owl pellet here. Now, we won't have time to completely dissect this entire owl pellet today, and that's okay because I've done some work ahead of time. So we'll get to take a pretty up close look. It seems like we found the other side of our rodent's jaw here. So we've got one side there and the other side here, and you can tell that they might belong to the same animal because they are opposite. So if you look at the orientation of the teeth way up close, see if I can get my camera to focus on them, you can see that the teeth are on the inside of different orientations. So even though they're facing opposite directions, we're seeing the inside of this jaw, which has the teeth on it for chewing. All right, let's keep going. Let's see what else we have. And remember that if you have questions throughout the program, keep sending them to us in the chat. I would love to keep answering some questions as we go. Like we said, this is a very patient type of dissection. It takes a little bit of work. Here we've got something different that we haven't quite found yet. If we look at the kind of interesting, more unique shape of that bone, and we'll get to identifying that one, which is a really easy bone to identify because of its shape, and we'll get to that one in just a moment. But let's keep plugging away. Even if we just look through this one tiny piece of our owl pellet, I guarantee you we might find hundreds of bones, because if we look back at that chart, right, these animals are made up of hundreds of bones, just like humans are. They're just much, much smaller. And what's interesting about these animals, right, is that they are also mammals. And so they have some very similar body parts that we might have as well. We're both vertebrates, we're both mammals, unless we find some bird remains in here, which are less common, but it is possible. Mostly you'll find things like rodents and moles, but it really just depends on what these owls came across in their environment. Now, this is a good time to start using my paper clip here. And so you can see that just like in those archaeology pictures, we have to be very patient and very delicate. Fortunately, when we're doing an owl pellet dissection, we're not really concerned with preserving these bones. Of course, we want to be able to identify them. So it's really important that we don't break them as we go through this dissection. But of course, if we were working with something like dinosaurs, that would be even more important, right? Because those animals are extinct. We're not going to get more of those types of bones or those types of fossils in order to take a look at. And so those digs, which is what we call when scientists kind of go around and you can see them brushing the surface with things like those very, very delicate brushes. So they would never use something metal like I am, like this paper clip, because they could damage the structure or the integrity of those bones that they're trying to look at. And we only get that number, right? We're not going to get more dinosaurs unless Jurassic Park comes true, which would be super awesome. But I think if we learned anything from watching those movies, it maybe not our best idea, but I'll leave that up to the experts. But of course, we'll get more rodents and shrews, right? So if you ever do get a chance to do this dissection, if you do happen to break something, one of the bones that you're pulling out of your rodent, that's okay. We want to try to not to. That way we can get the best look at everything inside. This can be really complicated and it takes a lot of time, but what I'm working on right now seems like a skull. So where my fingers were right over here seems like the top tooth. And they seem to be attached to this larger kind of structure, which seems like the cranial side of the skull of this animal. But we'll only be able to tell what animal this came from if we get off a little bit more of that fur, which is also kind of indigestible by those owls, right? There's no nutritional value to fur. And so that's one of those things that gets regurgitated since it's not absorbed by their digestive system as nutrients. But even kind of packed into the skull, I'm finding small things like this is an example of a rib of one of our animals, which we can compare to our dissection sheet as well. There we go. So that was a good piece of fluff or fur that we just pulled off there. I like to call it fluff because it just sounds fun, but really it is just fur from these animals that we're just kind of peeling off little by little. How many bones can be in one pellet? So I see a question from Jamie that asks, how many bones can be in one pellet? And it can be hundreds. So the human body has hundreds of bones, and so do these rodent bones, and so do these smaller birds. So it can be hundreds because there could be, like we said, up to 3 or 4 entire organisms in here. You'll never know unless you really sort through all the fur. And so when I did this dissection for the first time when I was in 5th grade, this dissection actually took us a full week. And so we had a full week to really investigate all the different kinds of foodstuffs and bones that we found inside our organism. So it was really a good lesson in patience, in that not all science happens instantaneously. Sometimes it takes a long amount of research and you can't rush it. But if you are very patient, you can find some very amazing results. Like we're just starting to expose some of this top side of this skull. So this would be like looking at the roof of this organism's mouth. So you can see the top part of its jaw. So we've got the front incisors, those pointy teeth there. But we've also got these kind of molars or other teeth from this rodent as well. So we'll take a look and we'll confirm that it's a rodent by comparing to our sheet once I get just a little bit more of our fur out of some of the different orbital sockets, which are where the eyes of this organism would have been in life. But eyes are full of nutrition. And so those eyes were digested by the owl, used for energy in that food web, and then put back into our ecosystem. That's the circle of life, right? So this organism did not go to waste. It really did fuel that owl's life. And that owl will, of course, give back to its environment one day when that owl dies and then is broken back down by the producers or the plants in the soil. All right, so we can get a pretty good look at it now that I've picked away most of the fur. So let's compare this skull, if we can see, to our chart. And sometimes the easiest way is to just very gently kind of pinch off the rest of this fur if your tweezers weren't doing a great job, because your tweezers, mine at least, are made of metal, which can be very damaging if you're not careful when you're using them. Because if you see this eye socket, let me focus my camera again. If you see this eye socket of this animal, it's extremely tiny and extremely fragile, and it looks like it did break either when the organism was being digested, or I could have broken it with my tweezers earlier in the program. But these bones are very, very delicate. So let's take a look at our dissection guide here. And let's see, do we think that this skull piece, this upper skull piece, which might be easier if I try to keep it turned sideways, does this one to you look like it's the top skull piece from our rodent? Tell me if you agree or not agree. Or do you think it might look like one of our other organisms listed here on this chart? All right, so some people are starting to agree, especially if I keep them near each other. I would agree. It looks like all of the orientation of the different bones and structures line up with that rodent. If you'll notice on moles, they're missing that orbital cavity because moles are blind. And so they actually don't have large eyes like rodents because they are not able to see as well. So they don't need such a large orbital cavity. And so this, I would say, from my perspective, I would certainly agree that this is probably the top part of the skull that belongs to our rodent. So we'll just go ahead and set that down right there next to our two lower jaw pieces from that animal's skull. Now let's take a look, because I said before the program I've done a little bit of work. And so what I did is I actually sorted all of the bones that I was able to extract from one other owl pellet. So everything you see up here came from one owl pellet. Not necessarily from one organism, though, because let's take a look. So we said we'd get to these kind of funny shaped bones. So let's go ahead and put it up here on our guide. Put it right here in the center. Now, does anyone have a guess or a answer? What part of the animal is that bone? Let me focus my camera again. What kind of bone would you say this is? Notice that there's this kind of triangular opening in the in this side of the bone, and then there's kind of a pointed projection coming from the end of that triangle. What type of bone would you say that that is? Couple people guessing a rib. It's pretty small. Our ribs, if you look over here, our ribs are very, very tiny. So we found lots of ribs from even just the small piece of the owl pellet that we dissected. I can pick one of those up. But you'll notice that ribs don't have that triangular part of the bone. So they're very, very long, kind of curvy, skinny. Oh my goodness, they're so hard to pick up. I can barely grab one. So this would be an example of a rib. Look how small. But they don't have that triangular piece. Lots of people telling me that this is a pelvis, likely from our rodent. So this second circle represents our rodent, so follow that along. And I would agree. I think that this is a pelvis, but look how many pelvic bones I found in just this one owl pellet. Let's go ahead and put that back down there because I got it from there. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 pelvic bones. And in each organism, right, we only have 2 pelvic bones. So there are at least 2 different organisms inside this one owl pellet. So this owl pellet ate at least 2 smaller organisms, which is really interesting to find out. But if you look around, right, these pelvic bones, they all kind of appear like they came from the same type of animal. So possibly all rodents, 1, 2, 3, 4. But I certainly found different types of vertebrae. So I have these over here, which are vertebrae, and you can really easily tell that they're vertebrae, which is kind of fun because if I take my paper clip, I can actually poke it right through it. I can actually string them onto this paper clip here, that gives us the opening for where the spinal cord would have in life pass through these vertebrae. So I've got these vertebrae over here, which come from one type of organism. And then I've got totally different vertebrae over here, which come from a different type of organism. So based on my chart, I would say that those smaller ones came from a shrew. Very, very tiny, look just like this in the diagram if we could see it way up close. But those other vertebrae look more similar to the rodents. So we can see that there were at least 2 rodents consumed based on the number of rodent pelvic bones we found. But there also seems to be pieces of a shrew skeleton inside this one owl pellet. So like we said, these owl pellets can teach us an amazing amount about the ecosystem and the diet of these owls, the different food webs that they're involved in, right? That they don't just eat one type of organism. So owl pellets are a great way to practice these kind of skills, these types of identifications. And if you are interested in paleontology, the study of fossils, this is a great way to kind of build those skills that you would need if you were to ever go out on a real dig for something like ancient fossils that are very, very delicate. This is a great way to start. Someone asked, where can you get owl pellets? And we ordered ours from the same place where we get all of our other specimens. We get them from Carolina Biological Supply. So you can order them online. They're not very expensive. You can get them from a biological supply company. Those ones come autoclaved, of course, which means that they are sterile. So that is where I would recommend getting them. I wouldn't recommend trying to find them out in nature because those ones could have bacteria or fecal matter or other kinds of things on them, which you wouldn't necessarily want to work with up close. So good question. If you are interested, there are also resources available online where you could do a virtual owl pellet dissection. So virtual owl pellet dissections let you very, very patiently, maybe not as patiently as doing this up close with your bare hands, but very patiently pick away pieces of a virtual owl pellet and still practice that identification of those different pieces of the animal skeletons. So would highly recommend it. It is one of the coolest online dissections that you can do because it is really similar to the real thing. So I will post a link to that with the description of this video as soon as it wraps. So if you are looking for that link, I will post it with the description of this video. If anyone has any last questions before we head out for Echo Live today, please post them in the chat. I'd be happy to answer a couple more if we're able to, or if you have them. Of course, if you are enjoying these videos, please feel free to like and follow the Michigan Science Center on Facebook and to share these videos on your page for anyone who you think might be interested in doing some of these science experiments with us. Or you can do science experiments at home by visiting the Michigan Science Center's website, which is listed right here on the very bottom of the screen. Otherwise, we hope we will see all of you back here tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. for even more Echo Live science demonstrations and experiments. So let's see if we got any last questions in the chat. Lots of suggestions for upcoming episodes, which I love. Please send those in the chat. Please send us a message or an email if you have suggestions for science that you'd like us to do on Echo Live, experiments that you'd like us to teach you or to do here in the studio because maybe you can't do them at home. I would love to do those for you. So make sure that you keep sending those to you or sending those to us. That's where we got our idea for our slime episode and to talk about simple machines. And so we'd love to keep bringing those to you because these episodes are for you learning at home as always. So bye, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we